You loved this, didn't you? So Dakota Johnson came on the show to talk about Suspiria. So this is
that was an ironic.
The Luca Guadagnino remake of Dario Argento's classic 1970s chiller. So Argento basically started out making sort of, gialli thrillers like Four Flies and Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and then moved into the territory of, fantasia and horror. Deep Red and Suspiria, which I think was his biggest international hit. And the original had a young American ballerina travels to Europe, goes to a dance academy where she uncovers a coven of witchy secrets. So now we have Dakota Johnson is the dancer who arrives in Berlin in 1977, which is the year that Suspiria was made. Very, very specific time frame. Goes to a dance academy where she uncovers a coven of witchy secrets. At the beginning of the film, we see a dancer confiding in her psychotherapist that she thinks that the dance company is run by witches, and there's a whole thing in which she says they're witches. It's all terrible, and the psychotherapist says, "Look, it's paranoid delusion. It's transference. It's putting all that stuff on." And this dancer then disappears amidst lots of stories about, she went away because of her political affiliations, because all the time going on around this, there's lots of discussion of Baader-Meinhof, there's lots of discussion of terrorism, there's discussion of political upheaval. All this stuff is stuff that may have been background noise before is absolutely foreground. Meanwhile, Susie, played by Dakota Johnson, turns up at the dance company, where despite the fact that she's untrained, she does an audition that has some kind of untrammeled power to it, which is spotted by Madame Blanc, played by Tilda Swinton in one of 3 roles that she plays. And she sees something in Susie which she thinks she can bring something out of her in a way that is almost supernatural. Here's a clip.
When you dance the dance of another, you make yourself in the image of its creator. You empty yourself so that her work can live within you. Do you understand?
Yeah.
You're in a company now. You have to find your right place. You have to decide. What is it you want to be for this company? Is it the head? The spine? The sex? The heart?
The hands. I want to be this company's hands.
Higher. 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 Higher.
She wanted to go higher.
I think she wants a little bit, and she likes the Tom York soundtrack as well.
Yeah, Thom Yorke.
Of course.
And of course, what's happening in that is there's this sense of defying gravity, of something almost magical starting to happen through dance, okay? Now, when you saw the film, I know that this is not a plot spoiler. I know that you weren't a fan of it, and you were interested to see what I thought of it, because I'm a fan of the Argento, because I had sent you an introduction that I'd done to the Argento.
Which I watched before talking to Dakota.
Yeah, okay, cool. And that was, I think I filmed that in the 90s. Certainly I was young enough to get away with wearing a leather jacket, and I still had most of my hair, so it was a long time ago. But the point is, if you're a horror fan of my age, and actually I think probably if you're a horror fan of any age, Argento is a really, really important horror auteur, and Suspiria and Profondo Rosso. These are movies which we all grew up with, and everybody afterwards, whether it's Richard Stanley or Clive Barker or whoever, are all making movies that refer back to Argento, and everything is kind of inflected by Argento. In the same way that no science fiction movie looked the same after Blade Runner, everything kind of existed in the post-Blade Runner universe. The same was sort of true of Argento. And obviously I'm very good friends with Alan Jones, who wrote Argento, The Man, the Myth and the Magic, and is kind of, Argento's great interpreter over here. So I went into seeing this knowing that I'm a huge fan of the original, and knowing that I've met some people who really liked the remake. In fact, some people had said that they thought that the remake was a superior film. Here was my feeling about it. In the case of the Argento, everything is to do with style. Everything is to do with that thing that I love, which is show, don't tell, which was to do with visual storytelling. When we did Secrets of Cinema, there is a sequence that we used of our heroine arriving at the airport, and nothing happens. She gets off the plane, she walks through the airport, she gets into a taxi in the rain, and the taxi takes her to the academy. But everything about the film is telling you the story, the backstory, what's going on. It's obviously it's the lighting, it's the camera angles, it's the kind of overcranked performance, it's the score, it's the Goblin score, which is actually is literally saying.
When you say Goblin score, this is the band.
Yeah, which was the people who were providing the music for it, and it's a kind of proggy score, but it's got this sort of witchy sound in the background, so it's setting everything up through that. In the case of this, what's happened is that they've said, firstly, the Argento seems to exist in a slightly timeless... I mean, it does have references to where it is and to, political backstory, but they're in the background. This is very specifically set in, said at the beginning, divided Berlin, and it's 1977, and it's not just that all of the news footage of hijackings and discussion about Nazi legacy and the changing role of women in society pre and post-war. That stuff isn't in the background. That stuff is right up in the foreground because people are constantly talking about it, and it's constantly being, pushed forward. And the plot is, from my point of view, constantly getting obfuscated by this whole other areas which have been laden onto the film. I mean, the Argento film is, the longest version is around about 100 minutes long. This adds an hour to that. This is 2.5 hours long. So firstly, there's a weird thing about just basically loading it with a load of stuff that feels serious, that feels as if what you've done is you've made subtext supertext. The second thing that it does, which is odd, is that in the Argento film, you had this sense of cinematic joy. I mean, Guillermo del Toro said that it was the perfect embodiment of a kind of a growing madness and pure cinematic joy. And what he meant was that what Argento was doing was telling the film in a really cinematic fashion that often narratively, and this is very, very true of Argento, didn't make logical sense, but made sense in terms of the film. And the weird thing about this is that although it has visual nods, I mean, there is a 70s inflected visual sensibility. There are kind of wobbly pans and there are crash zooms, and there's a kind of period detail to it, which is authentic now to the way that it's shot. It feels the need constantly to explain, to tell, to lay out, to absolutely hold forth about what it's about. And the strange thing is that what that does is you lose that sense of electricity, that sense of vibrancy, that sense of urgent cinematic thrill that you got from the Argento. Now, I know that you're not a big horror fan, and certainly in terms of this, it doesn't skimp on, when it turns into horror and Grand Guignol and all that stuff, it's all there, and that's fine. And of course, it's interesting because the Argento itself was a great case of, it's extreme cinema, and is it too extreme? And can we have an uncut version or a long version? Blah 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 blah. Well, nobody argues about those things anymore, and the world has changed. But there was definitely a part of me thinking, there's a 90-minute movie in here, and it's just somehow been weighed down by this other hour of stuff which has been put on top of it. And it's funny, the reason I chose that clip of jump higher, 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 higher it is a good clip, but the sense you get is that the film itself is constantly being weighed down by its own, frankly, self-importance. And it's what you end up with is this kind of frustrating experience whereby all the things that made the Argento so memorable, so startling, so, visual and cinematic. It's not like Guadagnino is not a director who knows how to do that stuff, but it just felt like it got lost under this huge kind of baggy canvas of other stuff that had been put on top of it that felt self-important, that felt extraneous to the central idea, the whole central three mothers, all that stuff's going on in the background. Characters swapping roles, which, yes, to some extent made some kind of sense, but also I have to say, when you see people doing an impression of Max von Sydow as Father Merrin, I find that rather distracting. And the problem with it is that as a result of that, it doesn't have the visceral thrill that the Argento did. Now, I understand that some people, they kind of admire that seriousness of purpose. But, from my point of view as a horror fan, I just sat there thinking, did Suspiria need to have somebody overlaying all this other stuff on it? It's like a butterfly that somebody's kind of put a huge thing on top of it and said, there, carry that. And consequently, it starts to fall apart under its own weight. It quite often tips over into the risible. And again, Argento would flirt with the ridiculous, but he would do it in a way that was so full of frisson that it didn't matter. I mean, there is plenty of moments in Argento's films when you go, what? Why is that? Why is that there? The lighting is literally changing around you for no good reason other than it looks good. But it has this kind of operatic, Aztec sensibility to it. And I felt that whilst the Argento was a movie that leapt and flew, this is a movie that sits there and tells you off a little bit whilst being a horror film around the edges of it.